In this episode of Ask Paul Kirtley, we are going to talk about camp seating, first aid and first aid kits, keeping track of your speed on hikes, storing compasses, avoiding midges, unusual growths on leaves, and how to process ribwort plantain seeds. Welcome to episode 59 of Ask Paul Kirtley, and today I am out for a hike in a lovely part of the world. I'm just on the edge of the Cairngorm Mountains in Scotland in an area of pine forest. It's very pleasant. Bit of showery rain today. Hopefully it holds off long enough to record this session before I head back to where I'm staying. It's funny, people say, oh, why is it always such wonderful weather where you go? How come you never record in the rain? How come you're never out in the rain? I am out in the rain a lot. I work outdoors a lot over the summer in particular and into the autumn, and being the British Isles, we get our fair share of rain. But rain and microphones and cameras don't mix very well, so that's one of the reasons you don't generally see it raining on these videos if you're watching on the video, or hear it raining if you're listening on the podcast. But as I say, it's just showers today, so I have put the dry liner of my rucksack over the top of the camera, and hopefully that'll keep most of the rain off. And if there's any rustling on the audio, it's because I'm wearing my waterproof jacket, because it is spitting a bit now. Right, anyway, let's get into the meat of the episode. This is a question from Duncan, and his question is, I would like to ask a question about seating in camp. I suffer with my knees and I like to sit off the ground when I am in the woods. If there are no sizable tree trunks to sit on in the near vicinity, what ways would you suggest, apart from sitting on the floor, that I could make to keep me off the ground in reasonable comfort? I look forward to your reply. Keep up the great podcast. Regards, Duncan. Well, Duncan, yeah, you're not the only person who's got sore knees or bad knees. Quite a few people I know who've come and done courses with me or have done various trips struggle with their knees at certain points, whether it's kneeling in a canoe, sitting on the ground, as you mentioned, down hills, on hikes, various different issues for various different people, and I guess you have to find a way to accommodate that. In terms of sitting, clearly, as you've mentioned, logs are good to sit on. I'm sitting on a rock now, a moss-covered rock. I've got a little sit mat, like a bit of foam matting that I keep down the back of my rucksack, my day pack, that I can pull out and sit on, and that's so that I don't get a damp backside as much as anything, but it does also keep some insulation there, don't lose so much heat, and it's also a bit more comfortable. And that's something you could carry with you to put on various different things to sit on. So you might be able to sit on rocks, you might be able to sit on logs, as you suggested. You can construct seating in a camp similar to how you might create a raised bed for a lean-to. On my blog there is a couple of articles on lean-to shelters in the northern forest. Forget the shelter part, just think about the raised bed. That's something that's not too difficult to construct. It's not something I would do if I was just staying somewhere overnight just for a seat, but it'll give you some ideas. A couple of smaller logs across between some components that build it up off the ground, and that could be lumps of raised ground. You could have sort of here you've got different mounds. You could span a couple of mounds across with some straight logs to get up off the ground, and that's got the advantage of being up off the damp ground as well. More generally, you could build like you build a stack of firewood, you can build some logs up and then put logs across between two stacks. That would be one way of creating a bench at the height that you wanted that you could sit on, and that's pretty comfortable. You can do that in snowy climates as well, where you can basically compact the snow and then you dig out a little bit of an opening so you're not sitting on the snow, and span across with some small relatively small diameter trees, so you've got a bench to sit on as well, and you're not sitting on the snow, and then you can build a fire in front of it. So there's lots of those things out there, lots of ideas out there already in terms of creating raised seating. Other things not to forget about, of course, your rucksack. If you pack it in the way that most people tend to pack it, with the sleeping bag and the rest of your sleeping kit towards the bottom of your rucksack, you can just put your rucksack down on the ground and sit on the bottom end of it laid flat. So you'd sit on the part that goes against your back towards the bottom of the rucksack, and that's going to be quite firm because it's going to have a compressed sleeping bag in it, and you can sit on that as well. Clearly, once you set your tarp or your hammock or whatever you're using up and put your sleeping bag in it, that's not going to be an option available to you. But if you're just staying somewhere overnight, you might have taken your tarp out of the top of the sleeping bag, the top of the rucksack rather, set your tarp up, leave everything else in your rucksack, use that as a seat, and then just before you go to bed, pull out the sleeping bag, pull out the other bits that you need, and you've got those there without too much fuss as well. So that's another option. Piles of firewood you can sit on. You know, if you get a big pile of brash, put that down, sit down. It's going to compress a bit, but that can be quite comfortable. There's lots and lots of different things that you can do in that way, using materials that you might be collecting anyway for various purposes, or you could have them with you in terms of your kit. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas, and do check out that lean-to article on my blog. I'll put a link in the show notes. Next question. First aid and first aid kits. This is from Jack McCormack. Hi Paul, hope you're well. My question today is regarding first aid and is somewhat broken up into two parts. Firstly, how highly do you value first aid as a skill for bushcraft and the outdoors? As a leader and instructor, particularly on expeditions, you must have been exposed to occasions where your skills have been essential, and do you think enough people value these skills? Well, I'll answer that bit first, Jack. I value first aid skills very highly. I think, as you say, as a leader and an instructor, it's part of the skill set I should have, certainly from a professional perspective. And it's certainly, I think, a skill set that most leaders and instructors these days do see as a really essential part of their repertoire of abilities to look after people in the outdoors. And I think anybody that doesn't have a current relevant first aid certification that is teaching any sort of bushcraft in the outdoors should take a long, hard look at themselves. And then when you look more widely at things like mountain leaders, climbing instructors, canoe leaders, it's a requirement to get the certification for your leadership, whether it's mountain leader, canoe leader. You have to have a first aid certificate to get that award in the first place. So it's one of the prerequisites. So where there are national governing bodies that certify people to be leaders in certain areas of the outdoors, you'll find that they've got, as a matter of course, they've got first aid skills. Bushcraft is pretty unregulated. Personally, it's really high on my list. I make sure everyone who works with me has a current outdoor first aid certificate, and I actually organise first aid training for my team at Frontier Bushcraft a lot more regularly than the minimum that we would need to refresh under most guidelines, which is every 3 years. We tend to do refreshers and extra training a lot more regularly than that, at least once a year. where we refresh the basics, and then we maybe add on something that we've not done before, or look at things in different ways. And we certainly practice scenarios where it's realistic. So we're not in a classroom, in a village hall. We're not being taught first aid at work, where we just have to put somebody in a comfortable position and then call an ambulance and wait for them to come to the office. That's not the type of first aid training that's relevant to the outdoors. It needs to be proper outdoor first aid training that is relevant to being in a remote setting. And here I'm in a relatively remote setting. Okay, I'm not in the middle of a vast wilderness, but I am quite away from the nearest road. There are some very rough forestry tracks in here that have been made by a forestry machine coming in to extract some wood when they've been thinning out an area on the other side of here that I can see. But you'd never get a regular ambulance in here. You'd struggle to get a regular four-wheel drive in here. So it's a remote setting, and the situation here, if I were to injure myself or have a heart attack or a stroke or any of the things that affect people in day-to-day life, it's harder to get me out. It's harder to communicate with the emergency services. I might not have a signal on my phone. Those considerations need to come into your first aid training, as well as the practicalities of how to deal with bleeding, how to deal with somebody who's not breathing, all of those things which are part of any basic life support and basic first aid course. So all of that's very important, and I think it's something that should be current and should be kept up to date and practiced regularly. In terms of regular everyday people as opposed to instructors or guides, so people who are not working professionally in the outdoors but who enjoy the outdoors, I think you should have some basic outdoor first aid training as well, because it gives you a greater appreciation of some of the risks you face in the outdoors, and it might change the way that you approach those risks if you think about the consequences a little bit in a bit more detail. It also gives you the ability to deal with situations, to be able to look after yourself, and also to be able to look after friends and companions. And I think all of that's important. It's a life skill at the end of the day that I think most people would benefit from having. I can't really see a downside to spending the time and the money to get some basic first aid training. And you can do a basic outdoor, core outdoor first aid training in a couple of days. It's a weekend of your time and a few £100 or a few $100, depending on where you are, to get a good knowledge, baseline knowledge that you can then build on going forwards. And yes, I have had to use first aid from time to time, thankfully not very often in remote settings, and it's invaluable. Second part of your question. I've read many of your articles on your personal first aid kit. Do you carry a larger one on expeditions when you are leading, or require participants to carry a set first aid kit? Do you carry first aid kit when practicing your bushcraft skills on a short overnight or day hike? And if so, what do you carry? Many thanks, Jack. Well, there's quite a lot of little questions in there, Jack. I think there's more than two, but they're all good ones. So yes, I do generally carry a first aid kit. The standard one that I have as a personal first aid kit is the one that's on my blog, and you can find that very easily, and I'm sure that's the one you're referring to. I don't vary it massively from that as a personal first aid kit for travel, and it's also something that I can easily throw in a day pack if I'm out and about. Even if I don't have that with me, for example, I might be just nipping out into the woods for a few hours, I will carry a first aid kit that's appropriate to the tools. You mentioned bushcraft skills in particular. I always carry a cuts kit whenever I have a knife on me, and that cuts kit, I've mentioned it in an article somewhere. I don't think I've ever done an article on it specifically, and maybe I should, but basically what's in there are just things to deal with the type of cuts that you get from using knives, or just handling materials in the outdoors, small burns, that type of thing. So I've got gauze in there, I've got good quality band-aids or elastoplast, whatever you want to call them. I've got some steri strips in there, I've got small bandage, I've got tape, and I also tend to put some analgesics in there as well. As I've mentioned before in other places and on podcasts and Ask Paul Kirtley's, if you get a real bad thumping headache due to dehydration, caffeine withdrawals, or whatever situation you can think of in the outdoors, it can really affect your thinking and your ability to get things done quickly. If every time your heartbeat comes up you're getting a pounding in your head. I like having some headache pills in my first aid kit that is always in my pocket, and that's the cuts kit. So that's something I put in there as well, and that's all put into a waterproof A-lock sack, or lock sack as they're now known, and that works very well. And I will try and remember where that's mentioned. I think it's in one of my modular kit articles that it's mentioned, but certainly I'll probably do something separate on that. I think it's worthwhile. I'll add that to my list. But that's what I've got, a cuts kit. I've always got a cuts kit. Whether or not I put that personal first aid kit in, I might put it if I'm on a long day hike, I'll put it in. If I'm on an overnight hike or I'm traveling further afield, I'll definitely put that more elaborate first aid kit in, more substantial first aid kit, which is detailed on my blog. And as I say, I'll link in the show notes if you've never seen that before. So if you're listening or watching this session, you can go over to episode 59 and find the link in the list of links and have a look at that. And also what's really good about that article, because it's been there for a number of years, is that other people have made suggestions. One of the things I asked is, what would you add to this? What do you carry? What do you think is a good addition to what I've got here? What are your thoughts? And there's a load of comments there from people about what they have as well. A couple of good ideas there for anybody that wants to look, whatever perspective you're coming from. So that's that. Other part of the question, do I carry a more substantial or more elaborate or larger kit for expeditions? Yes, I do. We also have one on courses. So in our base camp we have a large first aid kit which has some repetition in it, of course, so that you're not running out of things. You know, if you're redressing a cut or what have you, you've got enough supplies. But then we've got additional items in there as well. I've never written an article on that, I know that for sure. I'm not going to itemize that off the top of my head here, because I would no doubt forget something that's in there, and then I'd have to correct it. So again, I will make a note to try and write something about that at some point. I'll make a small video on that. But yes, we do. A lot of it is kind of what's in that personal kit, but more of. And one of the other things I didn't mention that I tend to carry if I'm using an axe, for example, as well as a cuts kit, I'll take a large wound dressing. There is a large wound dressing in my personal kit, but even if I don't have that, if I'm just got my cuts kit and I've got some larger tools, or actually if I'm in the mountains, because you get rock falls and things, I just generally put an Israeli bandage or a similar military bandage that's got a waterproof dressing, waterproof outer on the dressing. That goes in the top of my day pack, and then it's just there. It's just there for when I need it in the top of the pack. And that's before I get to any other first aid kit that I might have. On expeditions, yes, we have a larger kit that's got extra supplies. It's got various drugs in there, painkillers, various other things, maybe antihistamines, maybe Imodium, maybe stronger painkillers than you might carry just in day-to-day life, etc., etc. So that's something I can maybe elaborate on in future, but yes, I do. And we have a similar kit, although not quite. So we don't have a dental repair kit in our course first aid kit, for example, but in our expedition kit we do. And the expedition kit is basically built from the course kit that we always have with us, so it's the same system that we're familiar with. Anybody that works with me can go and get that kit and know what's in there. And then for expeditions, as I say, we add some extra things in because we're more remote again. And that's in addition to other things like having a satellite phone, so that if we need to contact a doctor to speak to them, not necessarily to get a rescue, but if we need to speak to a medical professional or get some advice on somebody who's got particular signs and symptoms, then we can speak to them as well. So that's an additional piece of important equipment we take on an expedition. In terms of, and then the other part of the question was, do I ask people to bring their own kits? Yeah, I do. I tend to ask people to bring a cuts kit, so that they've got their own supplies, plasters, tape, that sort of thing that we already talked about, for their own day-to-day things, so that if they do have a little nick, they get a splinter, they can remove it with some tweezers. That type of small kit is good to have. And then it doesn't need me to do that for them, and they're not kind of beholden to me. They can just sort themselves out. You know, as an adult, there's nothing wrong with doing that, of course. So I generally have people on courses as well just bring a small first aid kit that they can deal with day-to-day things, and then we've got the bigger kit there if we need it to back that up if they run out of any supplies, or if we need to deal with a more serious incident. And that's that kind of tiered approach which works well. A cuts kit and a big bandage, and then a personal kit and an expedition kit. And if everyone's got at least a cuts kit, then you're quite well supplied, in addition to whatever course or expedition kit you've got as well. And that's that. Hopefully that answers the question. A couple of to-dos for me there as well. And don't forget to check out the links in the show notes there at episode 59. Right, thanks Jack. Next question. Little spider crawling on me. Keeping track of your speed on hikes. This is from Rutger. Hi Paul, love your show. Having walked the high coast trail in Sweden recently, I have found out that during the day my estimate for my speed was all over the place. Due to terrain differences and getting tired, the markers on the track allowed me to correct this, but if they aren't there, is there a reliable way of keeping track of your speed? Terrain conditions such as inclines, rubble tracks, and dense forestation can make pace counting and the like unreliable. Kind regards, Rutger. Yeah, there's quite a lot of little bits in there. Fundamentally though, what you want to be doing is, so you've mentioned keeping track of your speed. Yes, but I think you should also be predicting your speed. You should be working out how long it's going to take you to cover a certain section. And you can do that on the day, of course, but personally, if you're planning a hike, you should probably be doing that before you even leave the comfort of your home or your office, wherever you're planning your trip. You can do that with the aid of a map. You don't need to be on the ground to work out how long it's going to take, or approximate how long it's going to take. You can do that by looking at a map, and there are a number of different methodologies of doing that. Simple arithmetic will get you to an answer that is quite accurate. There is a rule called Naismith's rule, and that's quite useful as a starting point. It's a rule of thumb, it's a rule of approximation that you can use to try and work out how long a certain section, particularly in undulating terrain, is going to take you. And it was originally posed in terms of miles per hour and feet, but we can look at it in more metric terms, and I think that's useful because most maps that you get, even in the UK, even though we've got miles per hour still on our road signs and distances are measured in miles, when you pick an Ordnance Survey map up, the same as you pick a map up in Sweden or you pick a map up in Canada, the grid squares are generally kilometre squares. It's generally a metric grid system that you're using. The distances that you're measuring are in metres or kilometres. The heights are measured in metres above sea level. So it's a metric system. So I think it's most useful these days to remember it in terms of metres and kilometres. So basically, if you work on the basis that on the flat you're going to walk with a rucksack, you're going to walk 5 kilometres per hour. 5 kilometres an hour on the flat. So any kilometre distance on the map is going to take you 12 minutes if you want to think of it that way, and you're going to cover 5 kilometres in 60 minutes. And then if there is terrain, undulating terrain, then you make an adjustment for ascent, so for going uphill. We all know going uphill is slower than walking on the flat, so it's going to slow you down, so you add time based on how much ascent there is, and basically you add an hour per 600 meters. Clearly you're not always doing 600 meters in one climb, so you can break that down and say that you're going to add So it's going to take you 60 minutes extra for 600 meters. So it's going to take you 10 minutes extra for 100 meters, or it's going to take you 1 minute extra for 10 meters, if you want to think of it that way. So you can basically, you can look at the contour lines on your map on the route that you're walking. You can add up the total ascent, and then you can multiply that by that factor that it's going to take you an extra amount of time, and then you can add that onto your 5k an hour, and that gives you a good rule of thumb. It's not terrain that requires scrambling, and it's not terrain that requires really tricky descents. The assumption is that you walk at a fairly decent pace going downhill. Once you get to really steep ground going downhill, clearly then you're going to slow down below your normal walking pace. So there are other adjustments that some people do for certain types of terrain to add for a descent, and also climbing really super steep ground. We're not talking about that, we're just talking about regular hiking terrain. That's a really good rule of thumb. 5k an hour plus an extra hour for every 600 meters climbed. That's going to give you a good approximation, and you can plan that out before you leave home, so you can work out how far you're going to get each day, and then you can work out how many hours of walking, and that's about the minimum it's going to take you. Of course, then if you're going to get tired, maybe you need to add a little bit more on. That's an adjustment, that's a personal thing. It depends on your level of physical fitness. If you don't think you can walk for 8 hours at that pace, maybe you either choose to walk less each day, or maybe you choose to make an adjustment for walking a little bit slower. Maybe you decide that on average you're going to walk 4k an hour. So back to the original question, when you said keeping track, what you should do is try to keep some records of how much weight you were carrying, what distance on what horizontal distance you covered, and what your total ascent was, and what the timings on that were, and then you can start to get to an approximation that is specific to you, and then you can use that in place of the Naismith rule. And clearly, as your fitness changes, that might change a little bit, but it won't be far off. It won't be far off. Over shorter distances, it will work reasonably well. You mentioned pace counting as well. Pace counting works quite well over short distances, but I wouldn't do pace counting all day, every day. You want to be able to think about other things. You want to be looking around at the nature. You want to be thinking. Walking is good, kind of almost meditation time, or it allows your creative thoughts to come to the fore. And you don't want to be counting your steps all day, every day. It's very useful for navigating on a bearing, in low visibility, in the dark, in the clouds, in a snowstorm. But just generally, you want to be using timing more readily. And once you get to a point where you know how long it's going to take you to cover a certain distance, you can just use your watch. In terms of keeping track of your speed, whether or not you're working at the pace you think you're working, you should be doing that from your map reading. Yeah, you don't need markers on the side of the track to tell you where you are. You should be able to do that with your map work and the terrain. And if you can't do that, if you can't keep track of where you are, then I would get some navigation training, because that's one of the fundamental jobs of navigation. It's about the way that you don't get lost is by keeping track of where you are, and by keeping track of where you are, you can work out how far you've come, in combination with keeping track of time. That allows you to work out your speed and timing and distance clearly are all related in that manner. So watch, map, that should allow you to keep track of how fast you're going, and you can compare that to your approximations using that Naismith rule, which you can do before you even leave. You can write down in your notebook how far you think each day's going to be, how long you think it's going to take. You can break it down into legs as well, from A to B. This type of terrain, it's going to take this long. From B to C, this type of terrain, it's going to take this type of long, and build your days up that way, so that you're not walking too far or trying to walk too far in a day. Okay. Storing compasses, so another one about navigation really in a way. This is from Peter, and Peter asks, hey Paul, quick question. How do you best store compasses with regards to preserving their proper magnetisation, both long term at home and when out and about? How much of an issue is it really, and can you do anything to fix things after they've gone awry? All the best, Peter in Belgium. Well Peter, I think the main thing to do with a compass is keep it away from strong magnets. The biggest source of magnetism at home really these days, now that we don't have cathode ray tube televisions which had strong magnets in them, I'd still keep them away from electronics. I'd keep them away from loudspeakers, so hi-fi speakers, computer, if you've got any computer speakers or anything with a microphone, with a loudspeaker in, keep them away from that. Keep them away from microwave ovens. Keep it away from anything that is magnetized intentionally or unintentionally. So large pieces of metal. I've got a bit of wind and rain, squally shower coming through now, so you might hear that on the mic. Yeah, big magnets at home. Put it in a drawer. Keep it at a reasonable temperature. Doesn't want to be frozen clearly because it's got liquid in it. I know that wasn't specific about your question to do with magnetization, but it's to do with storing it. You want to keep it at room temperature, and you don't really want it to be massively subjected to massive pressures either, because you can get bubbles. So you don't want it to be in a depressurized place. So I would always take my compass as hold luggage on a flight, as opposed to putting it in, sorry, the exact opposite of what I just said. I'd always take it as cabin baggage, not as hold luggage. You don't want it in the hold because that may not be quite pressurized as much, particularly on regional flights. It might not be pressurized as much as the cabin, and therefore you want to make sure that it's not getting bubbles in it that way, by being subjected to varying pressures. Keep it in your cabin baggage, and that's going to help. Keep it away from mobile phones. Certainly mobile phone in a jacket pocket, if you put your compass near to it, it will affect the needle. GPS units, some trekking poles have got steel in them, or steel components in them, so you can be holding a trekking pole and your compass, and that can affect things. I've seen people get to a fence line, so there might be somewhere here, there will be on the edge of this forest, there'll be a deer fence. The amount of metal in the fencing can affect the compass if you're standing near it. So just be aware of metal objects around you and electronics around you or on you when you're using your compass, and when you're storing your compass, keep it away from strong magnets, keep it at a decent temperature, not too hot, not too cold, and keep it at a decent normal 1 atmosphere pressure if you can, whenever you can, and you should be good. Next question, avoiding midges. This is from Russell Joyce via Twitter. He says, you talked of midges in a recent video. Got any good tips on avoiding or dealing with them? Midges in particular. Yeah, well, myself and the guys and girls who work with me at Frontier did actually put together a blog article on the Frontier Bushcraft blog, answering the more general question of how to deal with biting insects and other creepy crawlies in the outdoors, and what we do in different parts of the world when we're doing different things, and I'll certainly link to that in the show notes. About midges in particular, I'm in Scotland at the moment. I'm not being bothered by midges now. It's past that time of year. Where I'm sitting, where I am now in June or July, I think I would be getting nibbled. Certainly in this mossy, damp woodland. There's a bit of a breeze today, which always helps. So choosing breezy campsites is the first thing. Try and choose somewhere that's got a wind blowing through it, because that's going to help keep the midges away. Smoky fires can help, but there's a clearly another consideration there as to whether or not having a fire is appropriate, whether it's suitable for what you're doing and all of those things. So generally, windy campsite if you can. Clothing that they're not going to bite through. Now midges aren't like mozzies, they won't tend to bite through thin clothing, so as long as your skin's covered, they're not going to be able to bite you. On your hands you could wear thin leather gloves, and on your head you can wear a midgie head net. And I find midgie nets are much more comfortable and acceptable if you wear like a bush hat, like a boonie hat that has a rim around the outside, so it just takes the gauze netting away from your face, and that's just a kind of comfort irritation thing. At the end of the day, I'd rather have a midge net than not have a midge net. I find the worst thing in midge season is just cooking a meal, you know, on a gas stove. You're trying to, you know, even cooking a quick meal, the midges find you and they're going up your nose and they're in your ear and they're getting your eyes, and it's just unpleasant. And so just having the midge net just while you're doing those jobs that keep you in one place outside of your tent helps a lot, and a midge net just squashes down to nothing and goes in a pocket. So that's what I'd recommend. It's no more simple than that. And if you really don't want to go out in midge season, then just go out at other times of the year. But it's not the end of the world. You just have to have a few things: head net, light gloves, windy campsite. That's it. And probably a tent. You don't want to be tarping. I've bivvied with bivvy bags in midge season in places like Glencairn and Torridon and places. Used a double hoop bivvy bag years ago, and while you're safe from the midges in the bivvy bag, because it's so small, you're either out the bag and having to run around to avoid them, or you're in the bag lying down, which is fine if you want to sleep, but if you just want to sit down in the evening or what have you, I think a tent is a much better option. You can, you know, a one-person tent or a two-person tent, depending on how many of you there are in your group, these days doesn't weigh very much lighter than 20 years ago. You know, what my double hoop bivvy bag weighed 20 years ago, my Hilleberg Acto tent that I use now weighs about the same. So I've got a one-person tent which gives me enough room to sit in. I can change, I can read, I can do all of those things. I can relax in there away from the midges, whereas in a bivvy bag it starts getting quite claustrophobic, or you're out with the midges. So I wouldn't be tarping with a bivvy, I'd be in a tent in midge country. Unusual growth on leaves, and this is is this Instagram or is this Twitter? This is Twitter. This is a question from Twitter from Muddy Paws, and there's a number of pictures there of leaves with little, almost like grains of rice sized protrusions coming out the top and the bottom of the leaf. And the question is, hi Paul, I have seen these growths on the leaves of this tree and I don't know what they are. Any ideas? Yeah, they're eggs of some description, of some sort of insect. I don't know what species, I have to say, but they are eggs of an insect. And I'm sure other people out there who have a greater knowledge of different insect species will be able to tell us what they are. So please, under the video, wherever you're watching this, please leave a comment to let us know what they are. But that's what they are, and you see them particularly in the spring and the summer. You will see these on a number of different tree species, different colours, but it's not an uncommon sight. I don't know what particular species that one is though in terms of the insect. Another question, this one is from Instagram, from Andrew Casey. Ribwort plantain. It's a picture of the flowers of that species, and he says, could you please explain from start to finish of when to collect the seed, how to process them and how to cook them ready for consumption. Many thanks for all your hard work. Yeah, so they're not ready in the photo there that you've posted, Andrew. They're still in flower. The seeds will form after the flowering on those seed heads, and when they're ripe they'll come off quite easily, and you'll get fine little black seeds. You'll get the casings as well, and you can winnow them and to just retain the seeds. And then to eat them, you can do a number of things. You can grind them down into a flour, and in the field you could do that on a flat stone with a couple of small flat stones. It's quite time consuming for the amount of food value you're going to get from that, but that is something you can do. You can make a simple biscuit by, if you get enough flour, you add some, once you've ground it down a bit, and the reason you want to grind them down a bit is to make the inside parts of the seed more available to your digestive enzymes. If you eat whole seeds, they tend to go straight through you, and without being too graphic, you only need to eat like a multi-grain slice of bread and look at what comes out the other end to see the number of seeds. And you know, sweet corn is another classic example. It goes straight through you without your body being able to digest, so unless you really chew it up. So what you're doing with the grinding is making sure that it's all chewed up before it goes into your mouth. And that's why we grind seeds into flours, so we can access the nutrients better. So you're going to grind it up, flat stone, mortar and pestle at home you could do to get that fine flour, and it's quite tasty. It's a little bit peppery. It adds good. You can add it to soups in a reasonable quantity to give it some thickening and to give it some flavour and to give it some extra calorific value, some carbohydrate. It's also quite high in mucilage, which is good for the stomach. And you can do that. You can make little patties and roast them on a rock next to a fire. So if you had absolutely nothing, you could collect the plantain seeds in quantity, winnow them, grind them down, add some water, put them on a warm rock. And I've done that on exercises where we've been living off the land. It's quite a lot of work, but it's quite a nice result. You get like a little biscuit that you can kind of nibble on, and it's not a bad flavour. Or, as I say, you can add it into other things. The other thing that I've done with it, with mixed results, is something that was recommended to me, is once you've got the seeds, grind them a bit and then dry fry them in the bottom of a billy can if you've got one, or bottom of a metal mug, and then add that into a soup or a stew or something, and with the aim of releasing a bit more nutrition. The first time I tried it, I overdid the heat and I basically charred the flour. I didn't really realise, because it's quite dark coloured anyway, it's quite a dark brown colour, and I didn't realise that I charred it. I added it to this soup that we made and it tasted of charcoal. It didn't taste very good at all, and that's all we had to eat. So we ate it anyway, but it wasn't great. So yeah, do be careful about charring the flour. But that's it basically. It's like any seed. When it's ready to come off the seed head, they'll come off very readily. Winnow them, grind them, and then use them in any way that you'd normally use flour. You could try adding them to a bannock even if you wanted to. Mix it with wheat flour. That's something you could do if you wanted to bolster some basic rations that you might have with you. So hopefully that helps, and have a play with that and let me know how you get on. All right, cheers. I think that's it. We've rattled through a number of questions there. Yeah, we've all 7 we have done. So thank you very much to those questions, to the people who asked those questions, and hopefully the answers to those were useful and interesting to you. If you've got any comments on my answers or those questions, please go to my blog at paulkirtley.co.uk, find episode 59 of Ask Paul Kirtley and leave a comment under the episode. You can see this episode on YouTube. You can listen to it on iTunes, the Apple podcasting app, on other platforms as well, podcast platforms, and you can see the video and listen to the audio directly via my blog at paulkirtley.co.uk as well. And there is a separate RSS feed for each of my podcasts. So for the Paul Kirtley podcast and the Ask Paul Kirtley podcast. There's a separate RSS feed in addition to the RSS feed for my blog. So if you want to subscribe to them that way, you can do as well. Please choose the method that you wish to subscribe, and please subscribe. And if you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube and you're not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It helps the visibility of my videos. The more subscribers I have, it helps you see my videos as soon as they come out, because they'll come up in your feed, and it's really appreciated. If I am aiming to do a few more videos in the coming year. I've got some plans for things to do with YouTube videos, so if you're not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please go to youtube.com/Paul Kirtley, or you can actually just type in paulkirtley.tv and that will redirect to my YouTube channel, paulkirtley.tv, and that will go straight to my YouTube channel. Please subscribe. Lovely to have you there as well if you're not already there, and I will be putting out some interesting YouTube videos in addition, of course, to the Ask Paul Kirtley. So you know, it'd be good that you see those if you're interested. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for your interest. I am going to continue with my walk now, circle back to where I started while the weather remains good, enjoying these lovely Scots pine forest. There are clumps of heather here, sphagnum moss, there are blaeberries and lingon, although there's no berries now, they're all finished, but the leaves are here. It's lovely woodland of this type, and I'm going to enjoy that for the rest of the day. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I will catch you on episode 60, the next episode of Ask Paul Kirtley. Take care.